Hello, everybody. This is George Gruen at Gruen Guitars, July 23rd, 2021. And this is been 2 weeks since I did a question and answer session because last week was the NAMM show, National Association of Music Merchants show in Nashville. There was none in Nashville the summer previous for 2020. There was none because of the pandemic. So this one was an important event. Music and Sound retailer right here posted that Summer NAMM Nashville makes its triumphant return. Well, it was in the convention center and it was a return. So far as how triumphant it was, well, I would have to say that compared to the show in Anaheim, the Nashville show is no more than 1/10 as big, if that. And this one was half the size of the one in 2019. And I would not rate it as a triumphant return. I would at least rate it as a return. But sometimes size of show alone is not necessarily a measure of how well a dealer like me might do at a show, or even how well an exhibitor might do. I found it to be a very productive show for me, so far as making personal contacts with manufacturers, and just catching up on general industry news. The NAMM shows are still very significant. There were a few new products, very few actually, but those that were new, some of them at least, were interesting. One that I can show you that I picked up at the show was guitars from Gallagher. J.W. Gallagher set up the Gallagher Guitar Company in 1965 in Wartrace, Tennessee. He died in 1979, but one of the most important things that he did was make guitars for Doc Watson, who was their primary endorser. And that was also at a time when, throughout the late 60s and certainly into the 70s, Martin's quality was not like it was in the golden era, and frankly, not as good as it is today. It was a lot easier to get into the market by marketing an instrument that might look and feel similar to a Martin, but which many players might think was better. So that was the market niche that Gallagher went after, was particularly making the Doc Watson model dreadnoughts. But J.W. died in 79. His son Don took over. Don was also the mayor of Wartrace, Tennessee. And his guitars were, I think, almost, but not maybe quite as sought after, or maybe not quite as great as the ones made when J.W. ran the company, but they were darn close. And then later, Don retired from that. His kids took over. It did not go well. And eventually, the company closed. New owners bought it fairly recently and moved the operation to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is just basically a half-hour drive south of Nashville on I-24 heading toward Chattanooga. And the new owners have done a remarkable job, not only resuscitating the quality, but actually improving upon it and introducing some new models. In fact, they had come to me several months before the NAMM show, showing me their line, and I had commented to them that they were the best Gallagher guitars I'd ever seen, better than the originals, but that their guitars were simply too close to Martin's and similar enough in cost that I didn't particularly need them, but if they could come up with some different designs that were not similar in market niche to a Martin, in other words, not a different market segment, that would be more interesting. And they did respond to that. So at the show, they had a couple of prototypes, which I bought and I can show right now. Here is a jumbo size Gallagher, 17 inches wide. And it has the Gallagher peghead shape, but the inlay pattern is something they came up with unique to this model. But it has a red spruce top, and it has beautifully figured bird's eye maple for the back and sides. It's hard to find bird's eye of the quality like this. It's a very distinctive grain pattern, but it's a fine sounding, excellent playing guitar. And I find it quite impressive enough that I bought it. And another sample, here is a Dreadnought size guitar, but this is one made entirely out of native Tennessee wood. It is a red spruce top from the Smoky Mountains. It is persimmon for the peghead veneer, fingerboard, and bridge. And this is Osage orange or Bodock for the back and sides. And interestingly enough, it's walnut for the neck. So we'll add that walnut neck. This guitar sounds great. It has power, it has dynamic range, it has quality of tone, and using all native wood, it's amazing what kind of a result is possible. Persimmon is in the ebony family, and it is as hard as ebony. And in fact, it's hard enough that many sawmills don't like to try cutting it because sparks fly when the saw blade hits persimmon. But this is actually very fine guitar that I thought quite intriguing, and it shows, aside from the fact that it's well made, plays well, and sounds good, it is an instrument of real merit, but also sustainable harvest wood, all locally sourced, or at least Tennessee sourced. The red spruce grows on the higher elevations in the Smokies, and then Martin used Adirondack spruce, Adirondack mountains, but it's the same species of tree. It's red spruce, and that spruce grows all the way up into Canada. In Tennessee, it's only at the higher elevations in the Smokies. And as you go further north, the colder the climate is, the lower elevation that this tree can survive. But it still tends to be a high elevation tree that does not thrive in a hot climate. But it's a very fine quality wood. And it's interesting enough, though, to see that the Osage orange back and sides produces a result that, while it sounds a bit different from rosewood, is right on up there in quality. It's an amazingly good sounding guitar. And Gallagher has, he's one of their luthiers, studied with Brian Gallup, which is, Brian has a very excellent training program and apprenticeship program as well. And some of the graduates from there are very skilled. These people actually have the ability to make good guitars, and that was something new at the show that I found quite interesting. And next week I may feature another interesting find from the show, but what I can say is just because the show was small doesn't mean it wasn't good. There was a pickup maker who had some very fine acoustic electric pickups that we will be stocking. They're new to the game, and we're waiting the first shipment of some of those. And there were some interesting mandolins as well. But size of show is not always an indication of how productive it may be for a dealer like me. I can go sometimes to a flea market where it may be that 99.99% of the stuff there is mediocre junk. But if there's 100,000 items and you know how to look through them to find the hidden gems, it can still be an absolute bonanza. And for me, I would have to say that the show was very productive for me, more so than some shows I've been to, which are vastly larger. So it was good for me, and it was good for some of the exhibitors, but particularly some startups. Some of the larger companies, such as Fender, didn't come at all. But there was enough to keep my interest. Originally, it was going to be a 3-day show, but at the last minute, they changed it to being a 2-day show. And frankly, in 2 days, you could definitely cover everything that was there. But I think for some of the exhibitors, it may have been a disappointment because it costs them just as much to come to a 2-day show as to a 3-day show. And they might get a chance to meet more people at a 3-day event. But at any rate, it has come, it has gone. But some of the relationships that I established at that show, I anticipate will last for years and could be highly productive for the suppliers and for Gruen guitars. But we have picked up a few interesting goodies I can show you for the moment, new arrivals that will be on the website tonight. One, let's see where it be. This is a 1927 0028 herringbone, formerly owned and very extensively used by Norman Blake in performance and recordings. There will be more detailed information on this guitar and photo of Norman with it and documentation on the website tonight, but I can say that this is a 1927 0028 owned and used by Norman Blake. Very fine sounding, excellent playing guitar, and it is priced at $20,000. We also have a new arrival, which is going to be on the website tonight. A 1934 0018 Martin. This has original bar frets. As you can see, equal depth into the fingerboard as above the board. And the ones with the bar frets from 34, which is at least the first 3/4 of the year for the 0018. They went late 34 to the modern T frets and a T-bar steel reinforcement in the neck. This does not have the steel reinforcement in the neck, but this has the 25.4-inch scale, same as the OM model. When they went to the modern fret style T frets and a steel T-bar in the neck simultaneously, also in late 34, they went to a shorter scale of 24.9 inches. So that basically it was 34 00 size Martin, 14 fret model. If you look at the frets, if it has bar frets, you'll know that it has no T-bar in the neck and is a long scale. And if it has the modern T frets, you will know that there is the steel reinforcement bar in the neck and the shorter 24.9 scale. As to why they changed the scale length simultaneous with the change in frets and the T-bar, I don't know. I've not so far been able to find any record at Martin stating why they did this. I did check with Dick Boak, who had for years been Martin's historian, and he didn't have an answer for that question. I'll try to research it further, but when it comes down to it, the difference of half an inch does change the tension, a slight change in the feel of the guitar, but I have certainly played guitars with the long scale and with the shorter scale and found that both suit me personally very well. The Dreadnought guitars started out with the long scale and stayed with it. The Triple O guitars, 12 fret model, and in 34, the 14 fret Triple O, which came in basically just by renaming the OM as the new Triple O, and they discontinued the 12 fret Triple O. These have the long scale as long as they have the bar frets. The Dreadnoughts stayed with the long scale, and I could at least speculate that the long scale suited people who wanted a large body guitar, and the Triple O size used to be, prior to the introduction of the Dreadnought, which did not appear in the Martin catalog until 1931, the Triple O was their biggest guitar, and it had the long scale. But after the Dreadnought came out, that was considered the new big guitar, and that's the one that stayed with the long scale. Further comment on the NAMM show is that it was small and there were fewer exhibitors, but one common thread throughout the NAMM show and throughout the industry right now is how broken the supply chain is. Many manufacturers are not even trying to take in any orders for immediate shipment, not guaranteeing delivery before next year, and basically not even giving very firm guarantees on delivery dates at all. But Martin guitars, if the dealer orders them right now, in most cases would not expect to receive the instrument this year. And for some models, they might not be so sure if they're going to get it next year either. I can say Beard Resonator Guitars is completely booked solid on orders through September of 22. Collings is very considerably back ordered. Santa Cruz and even Fender and Gibson, certainly for most models, don't have immediate delivery. But it was a chance for smaller companies such as Gallagher, newly entering the market, to be able to offer guitars to dealers with the prospect of quicker delivery because it's a newly established company re-entering the market, so they don't have a bunch of back orders. On the other hand, it's a very small company, so it wouldn't take very long for them to all of a sudden become back ordered if a bunch of dealers want. But again, for me, it was a very productive show, although I don't go along with the photo caption for the music and sound retailer calling it the triumphant return, because it was a very scaled down show, but still for me, a very productive one. We have a series of questions that have been submitted today. Jim says, I very much enjoy your Friday video conversations. My name is Jim, and my question concerns your definition of the golden age when it comes to Martin guitars. You have said that you view the Martin golden age as running from about 1927 to 1938, when Martin shifted the X brace back and moved to the 1 11/16 inch nut width. I respectfully disagree and think that the Martins built until the switch to non-scallop braces in late 1944 should be included in the definition. I have owned and played dozens of pre-war Martins, although a tiny fraction, I'm sure, of the number you have owned and played. I've always been greatly impressed by the Martins made from 38 to 44 that have the rear shifted and scalloped braces. In fact, some of my favorite Martin D18s and D28s were made during that time. Can you explain why you did not include Martins made during that time within the definition of golden age Martin instruments? And okay, I agree that the Martin guitars made from late 38, when they shifted to the rear shifted bracing, but still have them scalloped, through late 44, when they discontinued scalloping the braces and went also during that time, during the war, they did not have a steel T-bar in the neck. Those are still good guitars. In fact, I'll go as far as to say they're excellent guitars. However, my definition of golden era is the ones that I consider to be the absolute pinnacle. And I would definitely be happy to say that the ones from late 38 with the rear shifted bracing and the thicker neck with the 1 3/4 inch nut width, which go through the first quarter of 39, are still extremely good guitars. And the ones made after that, when they went to a narrower bridge spacing and a slimmer neck, which we started after the first quarter of 39, and still had the rear shifted and scallop braces, are very fine guitars, but they don't bring as much money as the ones I classified as true golden era, and they do sound different. They are very good, but there's a certain magical property of the earlier ones with the forward shifted bracing that is distinctly different. And collectors and musicians who are looking pay significantly more money for them, and it is not without reason. So I'll say that the Martins with the rear shifted scallop bracing are still very good guitars. We could perhaps put them in a subset of golden era because they sure as heck are better than the ones that followed. They're still extremely good guitars, but if you play them next to the ones made with the forward shifted scallop bracing and the thicker neck, there's a distinctly different sound. And there is a reason why collectors and musicians continue to view those as the very best. And today, many makers of new instruments are doing forward shifted scallop bracing if they're doing things that are Martin influenced. And on the new D18 guitar and the standard, in fact, the whole line of style 18s and many other models with Martin, they are offering forward shifted scallop bracing. That's the standard bracing now on the style 18s. They are doing forward shifted but non-scallop bracing on the D28, which I find sort of odd, but they are doing it. But I can also say that buyers, players tend to find that they really do like that forward shifted scallop bracing. They like scallop bracing in general. But I find for myself that the difference in sound between a 1944 guitar from Martin with scallop bracing versus one made very late in 1944 with the non-scalloped bracing is not much different in sound because it still has an Adirondack spruce top through most of the guitars made in 44. So a 44 Martin D28 or D18 with non-scallop bracing and Adirondack spruce top sounds remarkably similar. So this change from scalloped to non-scalloped to me is far less significant in tone than in 46 when they had non-scallop bracing, but had a Sitka spruce top. Those sound very different. And frankly, I don't like them as well. We did have a question from John A, sort of related here. How has the bracing on the Martin D28 changed from late 1944 until the late 1960s? And I just happen to have handy a late 44. This is a late 1944 D28 herringbone trim, Adirondack spruce top. It has this graduated size dots. In 46, they had 1 year, 46, in which they had uniform size dots. So the dots were all this size here in 46. But in other years, starting in late 44, is when they went to the dots on the herringbone D28 and other style 28s. And this guitar sounds remarkably similar in sound to one with the scalloped bracing made earlier in the same year. In direct response to John A.'s question, how has the bracing pattern changed from late 44 until the late 1960s? We've compared a number of guitars and looked in them, and the difference is negligible. They basically, once they went to the non-scallop bracing, the bracing pattern, the way things were braced, was essentially unchanged for quite a while, from late 44 right on to the late 60s. But starting in 68, at least late in the year 68, they switched from a relatively small, thin maple bridge plate on the underside of the top to a thicker rosewood bridge plate. And that, I think, dampened sound a bit. Also, at that same time, they switched from having a steel non-adjustable T-bar in the neck and went to a hollow square tube of reinforcement, which I think in general is proven to be less desirable, not as stable structurally, although still pretty good, but not perfect. It was not until 1985 that Martin started putting adjustable truss rods in the neck. So they took a long time to get around to making that decision. But that still, I think, answers the question for John A. Essentially, the bracing pattern is remarkably stable from late 1944 right into the late 60s. We have a question from Paul. Here's a question. Are there any pre-L5 Gibson archtop guitars that are outstanding in terms of sound and or playability? Or does their value lie in their historical significance? Old Martins, even the gut string models, remain highly playable, good sounding guitars, but the pre-L5 Gibson archtops that I have played have always been disappointing interestingly enough, this doesn't seem to apply to Gibson mandolins, with some F4 models being extremely fine sounding instruments. What are your thoughts? Well, I, to a large extent, agree. The L5 was a fundamentally different type of guitar than Gibson has made previously. And the Gibson guitars have been arch tops from the beginning. They didn't really do much in the way of flat tops prior to the late 20s. They had a brief bit, starting in 1918, they did an Army Navy model that was a flat top, but it didn't even say Gibson on the peg head. It was a student model, but it was not until about 1927 that they were really doing much in the way of flat top guitars. And the arch top Gibsons with round hole or oval hole typically had a rather thick, clubby neck, and just did not really produce the power of a Martin guitar or the power of a modern F-hole arch top guitar. The L5 that came out was one made in 23 that we've been able to document, but otherwise 24 was really the first year of true production level for the L5, and even then they made less than 40 of them. At that time, they ramped up production more after the Lohr period. But the L5 is a revolutionary guitar. It is the granddaddy of all commercial arch top guitars today. And those early L5s from the 1920s through 34 have the 16-inch wide non-cutaway body and are some of the finest sounding arch top guitars I think that have ever been made by any arch top guitar maker. They are fabulous guitars, and there's nothing previous to that in Gibson arch top guitars that is any real rival for those in sound. But still, they're historically interesting, and they're good for some types of music, especially a bit of funky blues. But are they used by a lot of modern jazz players or many players in general? The answer is not greatly. So I'm not going to try to pick out any one arch top Gibson made prior to the L5 that I would rate as being a truly exceptional sounding instrument. But the L5s from the start were most assuredly truly superlative quality guitars. Jeff says, my understanding is that the first 14 fret guitars designed in 1929 were made by Martin in the 25.4 inch OM scale. 5 years later, Martin switched all its smaller body guitars to the shorter 24.9 scale. Why did they do that? What was it to affect sound on the guitar? Well, there's several components of that question. One, I've already addressed the fact that on the triple O, when they switched the bar frets and went to the modern T frets, they simultaneously shortened the scale to 24.9. But these single O and double O were already routinely 24.9 scale instruments, so that it's not like all the guitars switched scale. It was the triple O went from being a 25.4 scale to being a 24.9 scale, same as single O and double O had been already. And as to why they did that, I again don't have the answer for that at the moment. But the other part of this question, where he says the first 14 fret guitars designed in 29 were made by Martin. Well, the Gibson L5 from day one was a 14 fret guitar. And that was one made in 23 and the other production models in 24 onward. They were 14 fret guitars from day one. And those were very, very good guitars. The first OM was made for Perry Bechtel, a jazz player in Atlanta. And it was sometimes said that, well, he wanted a long neck because he played plectrum banjo. Well, the fact is he played plectrum banjo and he already played guitar too. And he was perfectly well aware of the L5 guitar. He was not deaf, dumb, blind, or hiding under a rock. And he would have had to been to not know about the L5 at that time. The L5 had been out for a while and was well promoted. And players like Eddie Lang were playing L5s shortly after the model was introduced. So there's no doubt that Perry Bechtel was well aware of the L5. So when Martin made the OM model, it is fair to speculate and be pretty darn certain that they too knew about the L5 guitar. It was not making the first ever 14 fret model, and for that matter, Gibson style A, the Curlicue Scroll. It was sort of a mandolin shaped body, but it was a guitar. It had a 15 fret neck, even going far back as 1910. So the concept of a longer neck was already there. Tom asks, wondering what your thoughts are on the 2000s era D18 golden era models with Adirondack top and same time period Martin D28 Marquis line. Do you think that they will hold potential for future appreciation, or will they simply be great utility guitars for those who prefer those specs? My crystal ball doesn't answer all of those type questions, but I think that it is fair to say that they are good guitars, but they are not so exceptionally better in any way than what Martin is making right now, such that I'm not really anticipating that they are going to have future investment potential that's necessarily all that much different than buying a brand new guitar. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the custom shop Singer Mahogany D18s that we are offering right now, made by Martin to our specs, are actually a better guitar than the Golden Era D18 was, because those guitars had standard mahogany, whereas the new Singer models that we have made by Martin have the Singer mahogany, where the wood was harvested in Belize between 1870 and 1920. So the tree would have been cut 100 to 150 years ago. And Adirondack spruce, forward shifted scallop bracing, which the Golden Era D18 is. But this Golden Era D18 made back in the 2000s was a fine guitar, but it's standard South American mahogany, which is not as expensive and is much more readily available than the Singer mahogany that we have that's harvested in Belize. But it still gets down to the Marquis models, which are rosewood and have Adirondack tops, are still, they're very good. And they're actually quite similar to the rosewood customs that we are offering right now. I've shown those on previous presentations in weeks past, where we have new Martin guitars in OM, 14th fret quadruple O, 12th fret quadruple O, and D size with Indian rosewood back and sides and non-torrefied Adirondack spruce tops with forward shifted scallop bracing. And they're very much similar in specs to the Marquis models, which are no longer being made. But the fact is Martin is making some very good guitars right now. So that do I think that the Marquis models and the Golden Era models, style 18 models, Golden Era, are they going to be more valuable than some of the ones Martin's doing right now? I think probably not. On the Marquis models, those guitars also have Indian rosewood back and sides, but there were Golden Era model D28 and D18s early on that had Brazilian rosewood back and sides. Those are more sought right now because the price of Brazilian rosewood is very high and the availability is extremely limited. So that's something that is not only discontinued, but has a feature that will cause buyers to pay a premium. So that is an interesting development there. We have a question from Greg Allwell. Says, I have a question you might be able to help me with. I'm curious how much a well-repaired headstock crack devalues an instrument. In this case, it's a 1998 Olympic Stanley Clark Deluxe that UPS brutalized, and I'd like to get repaired. Is there a standard percentage reduction or something similar? The fact is that not all peghead cracks are equal in severity. Depends on how it's cracked. Some cracks are much more severe and much more difficult to repair than others. And not all craftsmen are equal in their ability to do the repair. So a repair done by an amateur or even by folks who hang out the shingle and claim that they're a pro may not be all equivalent. We have been frequently able to take cracks that look like a total mess and end up with a result where I can't even see the crack with a magnifying glass, and where it seems to be structurally strong. There is still, however, the possibility that 10 or 20 years later, or maybe even 5 years later, when the finish sinks in a bit, you may see a slight line. And it certainly would not, in my opinion, be ethical to represent an instrument for resale value as being fully equivalent if you know that it's been repaired. But I can say that a really well done repair certainly ought to result in an instrument that loses not more than 25% of its original value. And some even less than that. If you get the result that it's structurally strong and you can't find it with a magnifying glass, the result is not necessarily so bad. It also depends on the value and rarity of the instrument. If you have something that's an extraordinarily rare item, like an original Orville Gibson guitar, which there's so few that it's hard, is not available. If you do an expert restoration, its value is going to be reduced less than something that is more common. But there's no really absolutely straightforward, simple explanation. But typically, if you have a really superb expert repair on a broken peg head, it might still go down 25% in resale value. And if you have a repair done by somebody who is less expert, where it's structurally strong, but you can clearly see that it was repaired, that instrument may not bring more than half as much as it would have prior to the damage. So it does matter. I have a question from Dave Cannon. I'm searching for the answer about a guitar that I bought used back in the early 1980s. It was a Gibson SG with white P90s single coil pickups, a dot neck without binding. The headstock was squared off without the open book cut on it. It was blank except for Gibson in gold letters. The truss rod cover was blank. It didn't have any writing on it. The finish was standard SG red. It had a small pick guard. Could it have been a prototype? And if so, around what year? Well, first, he didn't send any photos. And if he doesn't have the guitar anymore, he can't send me any. But without photos, it's hard to give an opinion to that type question. One photo can provide frequently more and better information with an examination time of 5 seconds or less than 10 pages of typewritten presentation describing it or a lengthy verbal conversation. But based on what's been written here, I have considerable doubts as to whether that guitar is a Gibson at all. It's not uncommon for us to see a Gibson or Martin name added later to an instrument, and just adding the name doesn't make it real. As far as would a prototype Gibson be likely to have had a squared off peghead shape? The answer is absolutely not. And would a Gibson SG with P90 single coil pickups be likely to have white pickup covers, P90 style covers? I don't recall ever seeing that on an SG. The only Gibson with white plastic covers on P90s that I can recall would be the Gibson ES295 that had a body size and shape and inlay just like a Gibson ES175, except the 295 had gold metallic finish, had the trapeze bridge tailpiece combination designed by Les Paul, and had a white pick guard and white pickup covers. But other than that model, I can't think of it. So this one, I have considerable skepticism about it having been a Gibson at all. If you've got it, still have the guitar and send photographs, send it to George at guitars.com and I'll get right back to you. But until then, my opinion is that in all probability, that guitar never saw the inside of the Gibson factory. We have a question from Scott. Would you please tell me your thoughts about the new Martin CEO? Thomas Ripsum is the new CEO, just started on the job. He's German. He was selected after a 2-year search that Martin had to find a new CEO so that Chris could retire. I met him at the trade show. I was very favorably impressed with him. He's been playing guitar since his teenage years. He took a sabbatical a couple of years ago to learn how to build guitars. He has an excellent grasp of business and accounting, personnel management. And I spoke earlier today to Dick Volk, who retired from Martin a few years ago, but was Martin's historian and also in charge of artist relations for Martin for many years. And he said he's had hours of conversation with the new CEO because Dick lives right near the factory. And he says he thinks that the new CEO has potential to be the best CEO that Martin Company has had since Frank Henry Martin, who was the CEO at the time when some of the most historic classic model Martins were first introduced. I feel very positive about his potential, but time will soon tell. So we shall see, but I have no question that the new CEO at Martin is well qualified. He has lots on his plate, but I feel quite positive about him. Jerry asks what's the price on the 1934 0018 that you just showed on earlier in this presentation? Answer is it's $30,000. And also the Norman Blake owned the guitar, the 1927 0028, which is an amazingly fine sounding guitar. That was $20,000. But the Sunburst finish 0034 long scale I just showed is $30,000. Another question. George Welch asks, what did John Prine like in a guitar? What is your opinion of using old wood for tops versus torrefication versus natural aging? Well, that's two different questions. John Prine didn't play fancy in general, but he did certainly know tone. And he liked guitars that you could tune low, because he did some stuff tuned lower than standard. So he liked generally large size guitars. And he liked guitars with a pretty rich, full sound and good dynamic range. But he had a wide variety of guitars he liked. He liked J200 Gibsons. He liked Dreadnought size Martins. And he had a Super 400 Martin he got from me that he also liked pretty well. So frankly, Prine was not all that fussy about the exact specs. He liked a large guitar that you could strum hard, that gave good dynamic range and had good tone. And he did have a good ear for tone. He didn't play fancy, but it suited his style. His playing and his singing went together. And it's just like Bob Dylan didn't always have the prettiest singing voice. And he didn't play real fancy, but he wrote great tunes and he had something to say. Well, I can say that John Prine had something to say, and he delivered it in such a manner that you wanted to hear what he had to say. And his guitar preferences were for instruments that suited that. He wanted something with good volume, but it had to have good tone, good dynamic range. And on some of the tunes he did, he liked to tune low, and that didn't work as well on a small guitar. But the second question asked by the same person is really a totally separate question. What is your opinion of using old wood for tops versus torrefication versus natural aging? Well, old wood is natural aging. Torrefication is heating the wood up as high as 375 degrees Fahrenheit in an oxygen-free setting, usually a nitrogen atmosphere. And that results in wood that is more brittle. It may look old, but to my ear, it doesn't sound like old naturally aged wood. And it is definitely more prone to cracking if it gets a blow to it. It's less prone to cracking due to changes in humidity because it's almost impervious to changes in humidity. But it looks a bit like naturally aged wood, but it doesn't respond like it. I am not fond of torrefied wood. Old wood, well, the Sinker mahogany that we have is old, and there's some Sinker top wood. But we're not, for Gruen guitars at least, building any that are Sinker tops. There is some Sinker redwood available. Santa Cruz guitars built some guitars with Sinker redwood for tops. But I still prefer the naturally aged Adirondack spruce for tops. But again, there's going to be some degree of personal preference, but none of the custom guitars I have made by Martin for Gruen guitars have torrefied wood. Jerry Black asks, with limited availability, are used prices up? And he also asks specifically about a Martin CEO7 model, for example. Well, used guitar prices in many cases are up, but it depends model by model and maker by maker. Not all are doing the same. So it's just hard to say that all used guitar prices are up. Certainly in the case, for example, of mandolins, F5 mandolins are every bit as rare as they've ever been, but they're not going through the roof on the market price right now. They're actually bringing less money than they did from 2002 through late 2006. Prices on F5 mandolins just skyrocketed, but it was driven by speculators who have to a large extent dropped out. And speculators are not driving prices much on standard used non-collectible model guitars, but they are selling well. But the fact is that in many cases, even a 5-year-old used guitar is sufficiently different in specifications from what is made now that the new one, if the specs are better, such as, for example, the D18 or all the Style 18 Martins that have forward shifted scallop bracing and a 1 3/4 inch nut width, those are better guitars than what Martin made 10 years ago. So the 10-year-old used one is not up in those. That is, again, a matter of each individual maker, and sometimes each individual model has different market dynamics driving the price. I got an interesting question. And let me find that. It is Bruce. Having recently purchased a stamp album gifted to someone in 1938, not even a quarter full, and it's stamped books for collectors where you have all these spots with picture of a stamp, and you're supposed to find the right stamp to put in there to match that spot. In looking up stamp values, I encountered this article about stamp collecting, and we have the article which I printed. Harry Rinker on collectibles. They look at the future of stamp collecting. And it's a multi-page article, but it's interesting to look at the history of stamp collecting, which has been a pretty big deal for many, many years. Stamp collecting and coin collecting, which are rather related. It used to be, Rinker is Rinker Enterprises. So you can look up Harry Rinker, Harry L. Rinker, R-I-N-K-E-R. There's various references to him on writing about in fact, it says live stream on the Genesis Communication Network, and also Harry Rinker's website, Harry L. Rinker at AOL.com, Rinker Enterprises. Anyway, he writes about collectibles. And he points out, in the case of stamps, that many of the collectors are getting to be geriatric. If you think about it, collecting postage stamps and collecting guitars, banjos, and mandolins has some similarities, but it has a whole lot of differences. There are stamps, such as the most expensive one, the 1856 British Guiana 1 cent magenta stamp, picture here, a mint condition one, which is incredibly rare, sold at auction with the buyer's premium for $9.48 million. But the number of people who are interested in buying that is very limited. And Rinker talks about going to a stamp convention, and it was small. Almost all the people who had booths or tables showing stamps were well over 60 years old. And the few people wandering up and down the aisles were, for the most part, also over 60 years old. And there's a small group of people who will pay big money for a few very collectible stamps. But the market is very small and very, very few younger folks doing it. But the stamp, they certainly wouldn't take one of these fine stamps and do something like lick it and put it on an envelope. Nope. In fact, they wouldn't touch it without very careful touching the tweezers and then putting it in a secure spot to keep it as mint condition as possible. They'd probably try to store it, even almost like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in an inert gas setting with no possibility of oxidation. It has no utility. You wouldn't lick it and put it on an envelope and use it to mail something from point A to point B. You wouldn't touch it with your fingers. You would preferably never touch it, only examine it with great care. But it's not even that you're paying big bucks because it's pretty. I mean, there's nothing really pretty about the 1-cent stamp from British Guiana. It's rare. It's collectible, but it has nothing in the way of inherent value or utility with a guitar. A guitar can be a beautiful work of art. It can be very durable, can last for centuries if it's cared for properly. You can play music on it. You can look at it. You can feel it. You can hear it. And if you play it and know how to play it, it's an interactive experience. The great ones feel alive and they make suggestions to you that you might not have thought of otherwise. So guitars can be collectible due to a combination of factors, but the ones that are really highly collectible tend to be historically significant and of very high quality, not only cosmetically, but sonically. They sound good. And some of the historically important ones were introducing new concepts to the guitar world, such as, for example, the Fender Broadcaster did things that no previous guitar had ever done. And that made it very desirable. It made it a market success very quickly. It influenced all that followed. It changed history. Postage stamps, we don't use any at the store anymore. Most of our customers never write us a letter. They might occasionally mail a check, but usually it's electronic transfer or a credit card. We mail appraisals. People want appraisals that are hard copy. So we'll email the appraisal and send a hard copy, but we use a postal meter. We don't use stamps. And when we receive mail, it's usually junk mail or bills. And generally, it doesn't have stamps on it. And if it does have stamps, it's something like the forever stamps that they print millions or however billions of things. And I guess they don't print billions of them anymore. They don't need billions of them anymore. Most mail to the post office today has postal meter, but the fact is most communications today in writing are email, not physical postal mail. The future of stamp collecting is not so good. Similarly, the future of coin collecting has also changed a great deal. The most rare and sought after, the most valuable stamps are things you wouldn't touch. Well, that's true also of coins. Coins are certainly more durable than stamps. They're metal. They can last for millennia, but they can oxidize. And if you touch one, you get your fingerprints on it. And there's no good way to clean it if there's any evidence that the coin's been cleaned, its market value is instantly cut in half. So you don't take a 1914 D penny and stick it in the gum machine to try to get something with it. In fact, they don't even have gum machines anymore much. And if they did, a penny would get one. So pennies are no longer used much. But how much change do I have in my pocket right now? I think right now I know I have a 50 euro, a 50 cent. So it's a half-euro coin in my pocket left over from a trip to Italy. But as far as coins, well, I won't use coins much. I don't hardly have a lot of dollar bills in my wallet either. Most of it's credit card, but coin collecting has become another one that is more older folks, and the few that are highly collectible are still generally sold to investors, but the number of people who want to invest in stamps and coins is way down. The number of coin shops and stamp shops has gone way, way down. In fact, most people around today have never seen a coin shop or a stamp. Coins and stamps used to all frequently be the same shop. Coin and stamp collecting was enough that there used to be a commonplace thing to see actual storefronts that were coin and stamp shops. You don't see that anymore. Maybe a few collectors and a few dealers, but it's a very rarefied few. And these days, if you inherit a coin collection and you take it to a coin dealer, the first thing that most of them will do is separate out the silver coins from the other coins, silver and gold, and weigh them. And that's what they offer you, is based on the weight. And if you're careful, you can have somebody sort them out and get the ones that really have value collectively beyond their weight. But much of it is simply weight. Stamps you don't sell by weight because they have no value inherently by weight. But the coins, at least the older ones, have some value there. But coin collecting and stamp collecting is way down. Guitar collecting, I think, ultimately has a better future. Stradivari violins, Guarneri violins are bringing more money than ever. And the finer guitars are doing quite well. We are not having any trouble selling the best guitars. We do have some trouble getting enough of the best guitars. And we have trouble getting enough of the brand new guitars. But we're not having great trouble selling them. Dana Duplan asks if we have any plans to do sinker model runs with closer to pre-war specs, with bigger necks, with that, and the wider string spacing. And the answer is, for the moment, not, but that can change. But right now, we're having trouble getting enough of the ones that we do want, and adding more models will dilute our efforts at this point. The amount of sinker wood available and the sales response is such that sales are strong enough that we're having trouble getting enough to fill the present need. So we're still not planning on trying to do more vintage spec at this time, and definitely not planning on doing any with the steel T-bar in the neck rather than adjustable rod. The adjustable rod makes good sense, and if you need to do any adjustment on a neck that does not have the adjustable rod, something that is a 15 to 30 second adjustment on one with a rod can be a $400 job or more on one that doesn't have it. But I personally like big necks pretty well, but the majority of our customers prefer the necks that we're doing and the bridge spacing that we are currently doing. one from Don Schenenberger. It's, hey, George, I bought one of Dan Fogelberg's D35s from you back around 2005. I bought his old guitar, but I think I still love it, but needs a neck set. Any idea what this guitar could be worth these days? Well, Dan Fogelberg, of course, is now deceased. And if you bought it in 2005, I would say that the value has probably gone up by as much as 1/3 since then. It had premium as a collectible when you got it. And he did consign a large number of guitars to me when he was terminally ill. He consigned most of his instruments to me. And they did bring a premium at that time because they were his, but I think that today the value would be up by at least 1/3. I have a Stephen Chrysophilae. What is your opinion of the new Martin SC13E? It seemed to be introduced with great fanfare, and then COVID happened, and I've not heard much since about them. It seemed like a radical departure from Martin, but is it the Edsel of Martin guitars? Well, the Edsel automobile was introduced with great fanfare by Ford and turned out to be a market flop. The SC13E is a radical departure, as he said, from Martin's traditional design. It is made in their Mexican factory in Navajoa. It has not been a great success at Gruen Guitars. I'm not personally fond of it, and that doesn't mean that nobody else likes it, but time will tell on that. But it is not a very traditional looking or sounding Martin guitar. And what will happen in the long run on that, I do not know. That's where to just again say that right now the market is unlike anything that I have encountered in my whole career. The shortage of supply of new guitars is unlike anything I've seen since the big folk boom and Beatles and Rolling Stones type boom of the 1960s. I remember going to NAMM shows as early as 1965, which is when I started going to NAMM shows. Before I was a dealer at that time, I was a college student, but I had a way to get into the NAMM show in Chicago. And seeing the Martin booth, where their main conversation with people who came there is, well, we're back ordered 2 to 3 years, and we're not taking any new dealers. And you can place orders. In fact, we advise you to order for what you think you're going to need, because we're fully back ordered. But if you don't order now, we can't tell you when, if ever, you're going to get the guitars. So that it may take 2 or 3 years, but if you don't order now, you're not going to get any. But we're sorry that we're not taking in any new dealers. And it's at the show, this NAMM show, there was a heck of a lot of dealers frustrated that their shelves and walls had blank spots that they could not fill. And their major, long trusted suppliers were unable to help them. It's mighty tough to order guitars if you're not going to get them for 2 years to anticipate what your needs are going to be that far in advance. But it's not an indication that the market is collapsing. I would anticipate that the companies are going to get their supply chain problems fixed within, most cases, within a year. And things will be available. So that will be a problem. It's correctable, although it is harder than ever to hire people. Government stimulus money paid a lot of people more money not to work than they made when they were working. That doesn't make it easy for the companies to bring back a lot of the people. It doesn't make it easier for them to add more people. And since their pandemic concerns have not gone away, there's still plenty of people who haven't been vaccinated, although most of the factory employees have. And some factories won't let people in who haven't been vaccinated. That is a situation that is going to get corrected. There will be production coming, and some of this tremendous back order situation will be calming down. But increase in demand is there and is going to be there for quite a while. Because right now, millennials are having their midlife crisis. People born in 1980 are now 41 years old. These people and their children are both interested. Millennials and the children of millennials who are now puberty through age 20, those people are buying. And the younger tail end of baby boomers are still buying. Baby boomers, by the typical definition, are born from 1946 through 1963, but people born in 63 don't have much in common with people born in 46. I think it's too broad a category. The younger baby boomers are still buying. We have three categories buying, and there's every reason to believe that the guitar market is going to remain strong for at least 7 to 10 years. And this is good news for people in the music industry. The music market is alive and well, but there's plenty of challenges. Obviously, if you are a musician, royalty income is harder to come by. Touring is where the money is. And it's only now that touring, road gigs, and concerts are beginning to start cropping up again. But now there are major acts touring. My friend Vince Gill is to be back on the road very shortly with the Eagles. And the Opry still now is back to full audience to fill the auditorium. They're still not doing backstage visitors, but they are filling the auditorium. And that's a major change. But when we talk about the record industry, well, most people don't do records anymore. They don't CDs. Well, most people don't buy CDs anymore. And income to be made off of streaming, well, that's problematic. So we still have changing times. But is there a demand for guitars? The answer is yes. Is there a demand for the best quality vintage guitars? The answer is yes. Is there a demand for just simply used guitars? It's interesting enough because a lot of used guitars these days are not as good as new ones. When I opened up my store in January of 1970, it was quite a different scene from now. In 1970, beginning of the year, a 5-year-old guitar was the beginning of 1965, and those were really good guitars. The Martin guitar that's 5 years old in 1970 was a Brazilian rosewood guitar. tortoise shell grain guard, and a steel T-bar in the neck. A Gibson guitar, like a 335, could be the old style body, and a really good instrument. So times change. Right now, a 5-year-old used guitar or even a 50-year-old used guitar may not be as good as a new one. And the used ones that are 10 years old are not appreciating significantly, but the true vintage classics are. So we live in interesting times, but that's what I can say. Until next week, keep thinking of new questions. The more difficult and complex your questions are, the happier I am. It's like Click and Clack on NPR used to have Stump the Chump. Well, send me questions that are difficult. I don't claim to know all the answers or to be omniscient, but I can research questions. And the more interesting, the more difficult the questions are, as long as they're relevant to the market and learning about instruments, the more interesting it is. So whatever the question is, think some up and send them to me. I'll look forward to another weekend, another week next week, and doing a presentation. The more questions, the better. Till then, have a good one.